Welcome back to another episode of Freight Pod. I'm your host, Andrew Silver. I'm joined today by Eddie Leshin. Welcome to the show, Eddie.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. I forgot we are on video, so I will remember that now. I am recovering from a few days in Houston, Texas, where I watched my Michigan Wolverines win the national championship. I was a little worried my voice would be working today as my fiance in the first quarter, as I was screaming. I mean, I'm a loud fan. And she goes, you know you're recording in 2 days, right? And I go, oof. I was like, okay, well, we're just going to have to risk it because there's no way I'm sitting here silently for 4 quarters.
Especially with that start and then the ultimate got close and then they blew them out in the last quarter. It was a great game, and congratulations to the Wolverine fans out there.
Yeah, I posted about this on LinkedIn today, and I'm just going to bring it up because it's present in mind. But Donovan Edwards, to me, I think there are a lot of great stories about the Michigan Wolverines. Of course, people will be like, "How about the fact they were cheating?" Blah blah blah. Whatever. Forget that one. You've got JJ, our quarterback, who seems to be one of the wisest young kids in the country. Who's a big meditator. Before every game, he's sitting out on the field with his shoes off, getting grounded, meditating, preparing himself. But Donovan Edwards, he had a great year last year. In the last game against Ohio State, he scores 2 long touchdowns, and he's our second running back. He is not the starter, but he is an NFL talent. He plays behind Blake Corum, who's maybe an undisputed best running back in Michigan history at this point. And he came back this year. He could have transferred. He could have been drafted. He came back. Did not have a great year. His yards per carry was like half what it was the year before. He only had a couple touchdowns compared to, I think, 7 last year. And he was asked in an interview just 2 days before the game, when they're doing media day, he said, the guy says to him, "Hey, you've had a tough year. Has it been frustrating for you personally?" And he just kind of smiles. And he's like, God puts challenges in front of us. He gives us ups and he gives us downs, and he keeps us grounded. And this was a challenge for me. It was a tough year for me mentally. And I went and I got a therapist, and I talked to that therapist all the time. And I just stayed focused on our mission. And the wisdom that this young kid has to kind of stay focused like that, despite the challenges, where many people would be like, screw this, I'm leaving, I'm getting out of here, I'm going to go transfer because I'm not getting my playing time. He said, no, I'm going to stay focused despite a tough year. He comes in the national championship game in the first quarter, twice gets the ball and makes a great play, runs for 40-plus yards for 2 touchdowns to really set the team up for the win. I mean, that was incredible to me. And
what's interesting about that is that I think it probably plays a little bit to his unfortunate circumstances, as you pointed out, being a backup, but also that JJ is such a good runner that I don't watch a lot of Michigan football because I'm clearly a Badger, but and my daughter's at Ohio State, so those two things don't go with Michigan. But ultimately, I'm happy for the Big Ten, and I'm happy for my Michigan friends that aren't the worst fans. But generally speaking, I think he was a great sort of back that took the ball off the short pass on the screens or on the outside, and they just had so much power and weapons to sort of take advantage of on the running game, and that probably took away some of its opportunity, even as a backup, because there certainly are good backs that play backup roles that come in for certain types of plays that are more advantageous, and it was good to see him have a good finish to the year.
Yeah. So I think I'll try to tie it into our conversation, which we're just starting here, but let's think about it from the perspective of kind of getting knocked on your ass, or in dealing with that. You and I are 2 people who have both had to sit out non-competes. And, that is in one respective way, getting knocked on our ass. And I think I heard you say on another podcast that you're a professional non-competitor.
Yes, correct. I'm a chief non-competing officer is what I like to call myself.
The CNCO. Right. So you've sat through two now?
2
Is that
lengthy
right?
ones. Yes.
And how do you mentally deal with that? How do you deal? What have you found yourself doing with your time when you're sitting on a non-compete? For me, I'll say I struggled at first. Felt like I got my ass kicked, and I was very upset, very frustrated. Um, Life's not fair. I found myself saying a lot, and I say that from a place of tremendous privilege. I've sold a company. I made good money, but still, the thing I cared and loved about most was taken from me. And you've had similar experiences. So how have you're older and wiser than me.
I don't know about wiser,
Sorry, I'm
older.
probably old. But how have you dealt with kind of getting knocked on your ass?
It's a really sort of interesting question because I think the first time I was kind of in a state of shock, and Robinson sort of came to me and said, "We're going to go in another direction," and I was like, "Really? Okay." And I was kind of like, I jokingly, it's not even a joke, it's really a true story. They asked me, like, when they were like talking about me leaving, what I wanted them to say, and I said, "Why do I care what you say? I'm leaving. You say whatever you want to say." I think I was just sort of like, good riddance. Go, fine. If you don't need me, if you don't want me, I'm happy to find something else to do. And I think for me, it was, during that period of time, and you probably went through this, the emotions run high on the first sort of like, what am I going to do? I got to get back out there. I got to figure out what I'm going to do. This non-compete thing is kind of like, will it stand? Will it hold up if they really fired me, so to speak? And it probably wouldn't have held up, but they had a bunch of money that they owed me, and I knew they would just hold it, and I would end up having to go after them. So, and it was 2 years. And it was literally in 2008, the day after Bear Stearns collapsed. And then 3 months later, the entire world went to garbage in the Great Recession. And so I think the way I dealt with it was like, look, like anything in life, you don't, if you work for somebody else or you sign up to do something where you're responsible to other people, but somebody owns your sort of job and your role, this is the risk. And so, unless you want to do it on your own, which then, as you probably also know, you're beholden to private equity or banks or investors. So, there's always somebody, unless you really do it yourself organically from scratch or with your own money. And so, I kind of just took it like, hey, I'm going to figure this out. I saved for this day. I knew financially I was in a position to buy myself a lot of time, to be able to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I wanted to explore doing other things. So, I mean, that kind of was the way I sort of, but the first 30, 60 days were like, I got to keep my network and I got to make phone calls and, get out, reach out to recruiters and see what else is out there. And then it sort of settles down and you're kind of like, okay, this is not the end of the, things in my life that are going to matter. This is just the end of a chapter, and it's certainly not going to define me, as the entire story or the conclusion of the book.
I feel like the older we get, the easier it is to recognize our lives or parts of our lives as chapters versus like everything seems so important. And it just, I just think about it from my perspective. Molo was my first baby. That was Coyote. I felt like I made apart my own baby, even though, I didn't start it or anything, but I put everything I had into it, like so many of the people we worked with. But leaving that, I was motivated. So I was good. I was inspired to build Molo. But then leaving Molo, there was a part of me that felt like that was my life. Like that was it. That was everything. As time has passed, and I've done the work, and I meet with a therapist once a week about this stuff, and I meet with a coach separately once a week about this stuff. I don't know, different words, but they do the same thing for me. They help me see the world through another lens. And for me, it's like I'm now, 10 months removed actually, and I am starting to see things through a more positive lens. One where it's like I'm learning more about myself now than I ever did before. And I think, I had a coach and a therapist when I was still at Molo, but I don't think I was as bought into them as I am now, because then I thought like, I'm running this company. I got these answers. I can figure this stuff out. Like I prioritized the business. So I would, I'd have homework from my coach and I'd put it on the back burner because, I had more important things in the business. Now it's like I got nothing else to do. So I'm doing this work, this kind of deep work about myself. And it's realizing like there were a lot of things that I had that were issues while I was running the business. And if I hadn't left, I don't think I ever would have dealt with them.
Yeah, no, I think
And so
what's
like,
interesting about your point though is, I think, look, there's always people that talk about the famous, how many times Abraham Lincoln, ran for office, didn't win, or the things that, there's famous like 10 things that he didn't do before he became president that he was not elected, or and there's plenty of those stories in the world, the people who got knocked down before they got back up. Certainly, if you look at Steve Jobs and what happened with Apple, and then when he came back, there's tons of those stories. And I think what that old famous saying about makes you stronger, the things that in your life that knock you down a little bit, is true. It's funny. I'll tell you a funny story I know you'll appreciate because you've been through what you've been through in the last 10 months. But I went to a Hawks game with my son right after, I think it was right after Coyote sold, or right after Coyote, I left Coyote, or I don't know, it was sometime during the Coyote situation. And there were two executives, one of the executives from Robinson with my counterparts from Robinson at the game that I ran into. And one of them was responsible for my exit at Robinson when they said, we're going to move in another direction, and, goodbye. And I said to my son, I said, this is so and so. I don't want to name any names, but this is who you have to thank for at least 60% of our wealth.
it's all about perspective.
It's all about perspective. I don't think he enjoyed the comment, but that's the other one. You'll like this story too. When I got to Coyote, I went to an SMC3 conference and ran into the other person who was part of that team that ultimately terminated me at Robinson. And I was going into the bathroom, and as I'm coming out, he's like, "Hey, Eddie, I haven't seen you." And I'm like, well, "Where would you have seen me?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know, around or whatever. I haven't heard, I haven't talked to you." And I'm like, "The last time we spoke, you basically fired me. So I didn't really think about calling you up to see how your family was doing, or really sending, a holiday card, but nice to see you, I guess." And, he walked away sort of dumbfounded by the conversation because he didn't know what to say. But I kind of feel like that's probably just a little bit about my personality of like, hey, I'm better for it. And, we can really talk pretty candidly about the way it really is.
Yeah. I think if we sit and hold on to anger, especially if we point it at the people who make those decisions to let us go, it's like, 10 months later, if you're still sitting there and you're angry at this person, what do you think that person's thinking about? They have long forgotten you. They have long stopped worrying about you and your issues. And it's like, you're giving so much power to this individual over you. So it's like, has been a big turning point for me, is like, let it go, man. Like, I'm not helping anybody, especially myself, to sit here and be resentful or upset or angry at what had happened, versus like, do the work and make sure that a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, I'm in a place where anybody is looking and saying, oh, okay, that guy did get back on his feet. That guy did.
For
He's
sure.
standing taller than he was before.
Right. And you know what? I think for the most part, to your point, they don't care enough to spend another thinking moment about it after you're gone. And, it's really about what you're going to do with that situation and from those experiences that are going to make you stronger and better. And look, I often say I would not be the person I am today if I did not go through those experiences that I went through, because I wouldn't have learned any portion of the amount I learned about private equity, about investing, about angel. I'm a part of Hyde Park Angels and angel investing, and being a deal lead, and valuations, and safes and convertible notes, and all these things that I just would have never gotten the exposure to. How to finance and raise capital. I just wouldn't have ended up doing those things. And I was a loyal guy. I probably would have never left either of my jobs had I not been sort of, come to well,
Kicked out.
yeah, or just certainly, they decided to move in another direction. And, that
Yeah.
happens. People decide that you're not the right fit for their organization any further, and they have the right to make those choices. So I may not agree with them, but I'm not in that position to do so. And so, I look at it as a learning and an opportunity to better myself.
Yeah, so I kind of jumped right into this through the Michigan quote and then into non-competes. I didn't give your background or your bio at all. So what people who don't know you may not know is, in the time you weren't competing in freight, rather than sit and sulk and just spend 2 years just counting the days so you can get back into freight, you went and figured out other things you could do. So you did join Hyde Park Angels, which does angel investing, and Woodlawn Partners, private equity you founded. So a lesson, I think, to anyone who will sit out and non-compete or something of the like, rather than sit and sulk, find something to do, find a new skill you can learn, where you can apply your experience or whatever you do know or learn something new. I mean, there's so much opportunity out there. And, I have that kind of one track mind. I definitely spent months with this kind of significant fear of freight is the only thing I know. I started in freight when I was 16. I barely paid attention in college. And, I'm 33 today, and now I've got 3 years where I can't touch freight again. I'm screwed. I'll never be able to do anything else. And it took me a while to get off of that kind of feeling sorry for yourself pity train, and now start to focus on what else I can do, because, if you can learn freight, you can learn a lot of things. So
Well said. No, I think
we'll
I think
leave.
that's a very valid point. I think it's hard to reinvent yourself. Some people are made to do it. Some people that are entrepreneurs that learn early to be an entrepreneur tend to know how to reinvent themselves or do it again. I think it's a hard trait to learn. It's certainly a skill, and I think trying to figure out how to reinvent yourself or do something different than is a really difficult thing to do. And it takes a little bit of that patience, like you said, sort of work it out. Some of it is timing and luck. You got to get a little bit of help from some other parties. It's not easy to just sort of start thinking about doing something else. But I do think that there is a vast world of opportunities and a vast world of things you can do. And it just takes time to sort of figure out how to plow through that stuff in your first 30 and 60 days, and then through that first year to kind of see how it's really as people always say, right, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it is a journey. And even with my kids, I always say, like, your first job isn't, maybe it will be your only job, but it could just be a part of your journey, and it leads to another sort of fork in the road and a choice to be made in a path. And whether that's the right decision you'll make will lead to another choice and another decision. I jokingly say to people all the time, I met my wife at college. I was 20 years old. She was 18 at Wisconsin. And, I don't think if I didn't go to Wisconsin or she didn't go to Wisconsin, I wouldn't be married. That doesn't mean I would have been as happy or certainly as in love with the person that I am. But I think that choice when I was opening the envelope, deciding where I was going to go to college, I wasn't thinking like, well, what if you meet your wife there? Would I have gone to Wisconsin? Maybe not. Maybe I would have gone to, someplace else. So, UCLA sounds a little bit better, or, maybe someplace out California or South. But, you know, I think it's hard to always know how those choices and those things that are going to come your way will affect you in the long term. But they're choices, and there's forks in the road, and there's paths, and you find your way, and there's opportunities and everything.
I think the last thing I'll say on this too is there's a fear you have to be willing to overcome, especially as you start to kind of foray into new things. Because you do have that kind of, oh God, I don't really know anything about this. Do I really want to go talk to this guy? Like, I don't know anything about private equity. Am I going to sound like an idiot if I go talk to this guy in private equity, or, whatever it may be? And so I feel like there's kind of paralysis of caused by fear of like, I don't want to look like a dummy because I only know about freight, so I don't want to start this conversation. But you just kind of have to put yourself out there and be comfortable being uncomfortable, or be comfortable sounding like a fool to an extent because you don't know something. Ask the questions and be curious and try to learn, and that will show you a path of what could be a next interesting chapter in your life.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
So last thing on non-competes, now, nothing to do with you and I and our non-competes, but where do you see there's the non-competes are interesting in our industry. If it weren't for, if you think about the way our industry works today, we're going to go to backhaulers after this.
Okay.
But so many of the successful companies in our industry that exist today are a product of, in some way, shape, or form, tied to American Backhaulers. And so in a lot of ways, if there were stricter non-competes in the world, maybe a lot of these companies wouldn't have existed because people would have been tied to their origin and not been able to leave or whatever. But our industry is very entrepreneurial in nature. People are ambitious. They see opportunity. They see it's not that hard to start a new brokerage. What are your general thoughts on non-competes? Should they exist? Should they not? We can tie non-solicits in there too. How do you think about the whole thing?
I think, from my perspective, I've always felt non-competes are sort of a underlying fear-driven way of trying to keep your employees in your company instead of really working with them to try to make sure they're happy employees. But I do get in a non-asset based business where you're not producing a product, there's no sort of trade secret type stuff for the most part, other than sort of some intellectual property and maybe some code, which most people aren't really getting access to. The non-solicitations have always made sense to me. Non-competes never did. I always felt like it was sort of a joke to sort of say somebody can't work. And I think the companies that created them always figured that they would sort of see how people challenged them if they came up. But I just am not a fan of telling somebody that you don't want to work for you or doesn't want to work for you, that they can't work in your industry. But not taking your people and not taking your customers, I think is completely reasonable and valid. And ironically, one of the things I think is the funniest about non-competes, which you will get now that you've been a CEO, founder, and owner, is that non-competes, when you sell your company, start the day you sell the business, even though you're working for the company that bought you. And so the clock starts ticking for your non-compete. You could stay for 3 years, have a 3-year non-compete, work through the 3 years and leave with no non-compete because you sold the business. The most important people in the company, the most valuable people that are selling the company to somebody else are treated better in a non-compete fashion than the people who work for that company. It seemed always ironic and almost just ridiculous to me.
Well, it's interesting because there is, people probably don't think about this, but there is like almost additional value tied to a business that has non-competes when you get to the point of talking about a sale.
No doubt. Agreed.
Right. And, I was never a fan, and it wasn't until we started giving equity to employees that we started dabbling with non-competes, and not significant ones. I think they were 6 months or something like that. But, maybe a year for the ones that were
Key,
significant equity holders. But it is interesting that, like, as you brought up kind of selling, that, like, I remember that being a part of the conversation is what do non-competes look like? And there is a value attribution to that, because how do you think about M&A in general in our industry? I'm just moving the conversation now along here because, like, do you feel like it works? And, bringing up, M&A ties directly to non-competes because I have seen a lot of situations where after a deal is completed, people leave. And there are a lot of examples. You've been a part of 2, 3, you've been through several, at least the businesses you've been a part of have. So Do you feel like it's can be a successful move for a company to go and buy a brokerage and expect that they will get significant return over time on that investment?
I think yeah, absolutely. There are good purchases and bad purchases in our space. And I think it depends what you're going to achieve. I mean, certainly if you look at private equity businesses that are buying and investing capital and putting, forth the effort to try to deploy more capital to help a business grow that a company wouldn't necessarily do on their own, those are strategically valuable investments for both the sellers and the buyers. I think if you're looking at people who buy additional service lines, those can drastically improve their overall go-to-market strategy or their company trajectory. I mean, if you really look at Robinson as an example of buying Phoenix or Freight Quote, those are pretty strategically valuable investments that they made to bring themselves globally and into sort of the digital marketplace on the small parcel and the freight and the LTL side. So, and there's so many examples. I mean, certainly Brad Jacobs has built a tremendous, valuable company through taking, whether you call it a shell or a small business, I don't know what he would refer to it as, and building out, a completely different sort of product category or service line than he intended to initially, where he was just going after brokerages and wanted to be not asset based and ended up, you know, buying Conway and New Breed and a bunch of warehousing businesses and turned it into a global, supply chain solutions business. Those are really successful stories. So I think M&A does really work. I do think, I've been a part of a couple of M&A transactions where, I own a small warehouse and trucking business up in Boston called Tie Logistics with a capital partner. And we bought Sheer Logistics back in July of 2022 with another capital partner. And, I think those opportunities are, how do we utilize capital and partners to help, take a business that is currently being run by an entrepreneur or founder that doesn't necessarily have the desire, the wherewithal, or the knowledge base of how to take it to the next level, or doesn't just have the desire to take the risk associated with putting that capital back into the business and, at whatever age they're at. Ty, we bought from a third generation. Sheer, we bought from a founder that was, approaching retirement years and wanted to certainly not continue to take the same risk, but built a great business. So I think it depends on the reasons for what you're acquiring and what strategically advantageously comes out of that. But I think there's a lot of really good strategic purchases that have happened in M&A.
Of course. Yeah, that was kind of a loaded, poorly asked question, not specific enough. So, all right, we're gonna go back. We're gonna go back in time. So you started your career at BT Trucking, correct?
BT Trucking.
So walk us through how you found your way into the industry. Why trucking?
Yeah, so
What was
I graduated college during the first recession I knew of, which was 1990. And I was supposed to go work on the floor of the options exchange for a guy who decided that because of the current environment, he was retiring and left. And I had 2 weeks left of college. So I was like, well, now what am I going to do? So I knew some people, one of whom owned a company called M Nails that ended up, who did they sell to? I don't remember who it was, but I did some Home Depot displays, end cap displays, and worked for them for a little bit. And then Paul Loeb had reached out and said, I'm a partner in this trucking company, BT Trucking. They need a dispatcher. And I was like, all right, well, okay. Well, I got to figure out what I'm going to do after this sort of project-based work ends. So I went to meet Mike Irwin at BT Trucking and drove up into Bensonville, Illinois, near the airport, walked into a small little office and got the dispatch job. And there were no, we used to run computer mileage. It cost $1 to run every time you wanted to run miles. So you looked it up in a Rand McNally book, and we had a circular board with T cards on it that kept track of all the trucks and the loads. And so I learned my way through that. And then uh, Mike and Paul had backed a guy who came from a company called Ace Pool Car, who started Blue Thunder Truck Brokerage in the back office of BT Trucking. And so I started to learn a little bit about pool distribution and started learning about cross docking. And I learned how to drive a forklift and loaded trucks. And then my first sales call was with a guy named Jeff Silver, who basically Paul called me up and said, Jeff's going to meet these guys. I think it might have been Norcall, but it might have been Willamette out in North Lake. You want to go check it out, see what, a sales call is all about. So I went to the sales call with Jeff, and then Jeff went back down to Backhaulers. And I believe the story goes, he said to Paul, we're growing like crazy. Why don't you bring him down here to help us? And I was ready for the next challenge. I sort of became head dispatcher. I had been off, learned a ton of lessons about truck drivers and loads, and almost got threatened to be killed a couple times for poorly acting for, yelling at a driver once or twice that I should have never done. And you're like, okay, now I understand. So I got,
that's when you've really made it in dispatching.
You know what? It was really like interesting to learn that. I really jokingly, but not jokingly say I owe a tremendous amount of my success to spending the first 3 years of my career really learning every facet of the business, from the truck driver, the loading dock, the pool distribution, expedited. I would never have known those things if I had just gone into work at Backhaulers on truckload driving. And so I got a really, really great education in the business. And then I went to Backhaulers and started as Paul's assistant. And it was funny, Backhaulers back then was 40 people. And I just sort of like started doing everything that nobody else wanted to do, which has always been the story of my career, because, we did contracts and no one ever read them. And I started reading them and then talking to lawyers and, coming up with better claims processes and really sort of the fundamental operational services. Plus I had a group and grew my group. And actually my claim to fame is the first month that I ever beat Paul in dollars, not loads, because he did a lot of loads, but he didn't do a lot of dollars. And I did a lot of dollars and not a lot of loads because I didn't like that part of the business. The first month I ever beat him was the last month he was a sales rep. Then he dispersed all his accounts and went on to, obviously build Backhaulers to what it became, and sold it to Robinson. But it was funny. I mean, it is really remarkable, the talent that came out of that place. And, I learned every facet of the business from, really growing from 40 people to 700 people.
So you come in, there's 40 employees, and Backhaulers looks and feels, at least based on what I'm gathering, listening to this, hearing Paul Loeb, he's the CEO. Now, for those who have been listening to this podcast for a while, his name has come up a few times. He is known in a lot of circles as kind of the Godfather of freight brokerage, because, Backhaulers is the origin story for so many great companies today. And it's funny, though, as I hear you talk about, Paul had 40, 50, 60 employees, and he's managing his own accounts, and, everybody's kind of doing everything, and everybody's got to sell. And then you start to grow and you start to pass that stuff off. And there's an assistant or an ops type person who's figuring out the contracts. Okay, we've got claims, got to figure out how to settle claims, handle claims, and starts to build processes. And it's like, what was that company in the early 90s? It reminds me a lot of what my company looked like in 2018, 2019. And I think a lot of other brokers who are probably listening to this think, dang, that's what my 50-person company looks like today. The technology probably was a little different back then. Not probably, it definitely was. What would give us some color into what brokerage looked like in the early 90s? Macro point forecasts did not exist. Right? No, we were nowhere near that. So it's kind of paint a picture for us.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I don't think you didn't know what you didn't have till you had it later and look back and said, I can't believe we did it, right? But literally, like, we used to write down, I mean, we had books of information like directions. There was no Google Maps. There was no, if you were giving driver directions to a place, you looked in the book for the name of the warehouse and you read them the directions that you had gotten for the driver. I mean, it just,
So for example, so you're taking a load from Norcol, John
yep.
Bendix load. He's got a
I
rolls of
didn't work in
paper
paper. That was
North
Jeff's
Lake.
department. I did not do paper.
Just for the example, North Lake, Illinois to Columbus, Ohio. When he gives you that order for $800, he also spends 5 minutes reciting the directions
No,
to you that you then write
no.
down.
So what happened back then
No,
was that, so you had like Norcol Direct. So I don't remember there was a computer at Backhaulers when I started, even though there was stuff falling down from the ceiling on your desk that might have taken out, a few papers or maybe a computer or a phone. Or Jeff was busy, knocking down walls to expand space. Um, but the crux of it was there was a computer system that sort of tracked orders, and I think it was really more kind of for the financial aspects of trying to keep track of things than it really was about freight brokering. And then there was the icon, which I don't really know. You'd have to ask Jeff about this, but the icon was sort of like the next technology, and it sort of had some pieces of the transactional, but the real like underlying informational stuff that was important to a load was nowhere. So when John called you and gave you that load, and whoever it was going to in Columbus, Ohio, let's say it was going to Piggly Wiggly, you wrote down, you entered the order, you wrote it down on a pink pad, which if you go to the ABH Facebook page, you can see all these things that people still had, like a pink pad was your orders. And it was, at first it was, you know, what did they call that? Where it went through to the second piece. So you had the record in case the order got lost, but I get carbon, whatever it was. But
Oh, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
so you it was like a checkbook register where you wrote the check, and then below it was another piece of paper that kept track of what check
You
you
can see
wrote.
another piece of paper
Right.
that kind of kept it.
So,
Yep.
you wrote down the order, and then you'd call the place you were going to deliver to, because we dispatched, well before me. Well, I don't know, well before me, but before me, they had already really separated into customer and carrier the Chicago way, the Chicago, style, and
Split
the
model.
split model, which was really, we can get to, but a direct result of the carriers telling backhaulers how much they hated Robinson's structure of having to call each office and never getting treated well by one party or the other. So they were like, well, why don't we treat them like a customer? But you would go and you would call that warehouse to find out the information, no differently than you did growing up in this business. And you'd be like, okay, what's your hours? Do I need an appointment? And can you give me directions off the major interstate for the driver? And you'd put that in a book so you didn't have to call back again every time to ask and write it down. So then when the driver was in dispatch, you'd be like, okay, what's your load number? You'd pull the load up in the system, and then they'd be like, do you need directions? Yes. And you'd go and you pull the book out, and you'd be like, here's the directions. Eventually that got moved into from icon or whatever the next one was. And, eventually we didn't have books anymore. But I remember being at a late '90s Grateful Dead show when I got a call. I just got home at like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I got a call from Paul or Jeff, or yeah, it was Paul. I think it was Paul, that the system had crashed and the backup was 6 hours behind, and we were going to have to re-enter all the loads. And we worked for like 36 straight hours to re-enter all the loads into the computer before Monday morning, because it was like a Friday night show or a Saturday night show that I went to. And that was the life, you just sort of like did what you had to do. And, that was it.
There's something so bonding about those moments.
For sure.
Those oh shit moments where it's like, this is do or die for the business. And if we don't all come together right now for whether it's 36 hours, 12 hours, whatever, and show up, like there is no business on
Do you
Monday.
remember my first? Oh, you were not there. Were you there my first week at Coyote? The first week.
Was it the winter snowstorm?
Well, that was when everyone stayed in the. I don't know if it was the winter snowstorm or another storm before the winter snowstorm, but basically we had to wheel chairs with computers down the street to the arcade because there was no
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
power in the building, and like that was my first week at Coyote. I was wheeling a chair with computers stacked up and cords around my neck
Yeah,
and like down the
to,
street.
to paint the picture for listeners, Coyote's office was in Lake Forest, Illinois, and we had one building that we started with the first floor or whatever, and then we got the second floor and just kind of kept growing. And then we had to go get a building down the street where we were also putting desks. But I guess to your point in this story, and I remember this because it was chaos. I remember we were sending people to our house in Lake Bluff. It was anywhere where there was internet. This was during a workday, like in the middle of the day or something, where everything was gone. All the power was out, and there was no way for us to do our jobs. And it was a Tuesday morning or whatever. The term freight never sleeps. It certainly doesn't sleep at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday during the workday. And
I think it was a Friday because I think we worked all weekend to figure out what we were going to do for Monday morning. But it was like, that was like my first week. I was like, oh, glad I signed up for this.
This company doesn't even have power.
But it was funny because I had already worked on a redundancy plan at Robinson. So I was like, okay, we'll fix this. This will not happen again.
Yep. So, okay, sticking back with Backhaulers. So, you were there for 7 years from 92 to 99 when the company gets sold. Let me ask you this. You grew into the VP of Ops role. You ran the operations of the business. What are some of the things that in your mind drove the success of that business? Like, why was Backhaulers such a powerful kind of company in the industry, and what do you think drove that?
I think it was just the most innovative company in the space at the time, which, look, you got to, give credit where credit is due. Paul was willing to reinvest every dollar in the business and had the vision. Jeff was certainly capable of, thinking outside the box and trying to utilize technology and develop, different sort of ways of thinking about it, training programs and bringing in classes of people. And John Thompson, who, you don't hear as much about these days because I think he's been out of the business for a little bit. But Johnny, really built what we know as the Chicago style carrier system today. And some of the greatest, leaders from the carrier services side of the business or capacity sourcing side came from his tutelage. And, there was just, I don't remember who I was talking to the other day that said to me, it's about the team. I mean, people would jokingly call it the Beatles. And whether or not you think of it as Jeff, Paul, and John, in the same capacity of who was the other party, in that foursome, there were plenty of people that became sort of integral to that business. That could have been the fourth or fifth, and person responsible for that team. But it does take a team, and I'm sure you know that from building your business. And I think the same thing at Coyote. I mean, we had an incredible team of people, and I think that when you can trust everybody to do their part, and you can trust that those people are as loyal and as passionate about the business and the direction as the others, then I think that's what gives you the ability to sort of take the risks and drive the business to be the success that Backhaulers was. But it takes that vision and that leadership from Paul to, want it to be that business and those people to take those risks. And, one of the early parts of Backhaulers was Noam Frankel, who I don't know if you know, but, Noam left right after I got there. And I think that there was just a difference of opinion about the direction of the business that Jeff and Paul had than Noam had. And I think Noam decided he was just going to get bought out and go in another direction. So, that's where you sort of kind of think about directionally what was the things that define that business. I think it's the people that made the people underneath them stronger, smarter, better. We just never took no for an answer and did our jobs to the best of our ability and started at the top.
So the team, never taking no for an answer. That's one that is definitely needs to ring true when you think about successful brokers. You said an interesting thing too about people making those below them better. If there's one thing I've gotten to know about you from working together with you at Coyote is you are very much respected and revered and seen as a mentor by a lot of the mid-level, high-level, kind of young, up-and-coming people. Coyote was littered with very talented people, young people who had come out of college and rose the ranks. This wasn't a company that was just kind of hiring a bunch of people from outside and putting them in big roles. It was very much people were able to grow into these big roles, and you were definitely seen as someone who helped a lot of people along the way. I'm curious, can you talk about your leadership style a little bit and what's the best way to ask this question? Like how do you become a good mentor? Is maybe a good question to start with there. And how do you think about your role as you did come into Coyote eventually? We're skipping over Robinson for a minute, but just because my experience with you was at Coyote and these folks who I worked with, the Cameron Ramsdales of the world, all these folks that really kind of respect you and looked up to you.
So I think it's a really fascinating question because I don't know if I have a true answer to what makes me, well, I shouldn't say what makes me, but how do you become a great mentor? I think, you know, what's made me so successful in mentoring and developing talent has always been unselfishness, and not thinking about myself. I tend to always think that one of my strengths and weaknesses has been that I put everybody before me. I said to you earlier, I don't know if on the, if it was on the pre or during the call today, that, I probably would have never left either of my jobs had I not sort of been asked to leave, or people decided to go in a different direction and I wasn't part of that choice. And I'm pretty loyal to a fault, including at Backhaulers to Paul. I was the one who stayed at Robinson after Jeff left, John left, Paul left. I was the one left. And I stayed for 8 more years. Now, some of that was circumstantial. I was younger than them. I had, primarily not, I had 2 young kids at home. So I think, the unselfishness and desire, I've always found it to be incredibly satisfying to see other people succeed. I don't know if it's you know, a characteristic that I just think it's incredibly satisfying to see people succeed and to help them be more successful. And I've never thought of myself as somebody that's smarter than anyone else in the room. We all come from different sort of experiences and backgrounds. And so I always enjoy being around smart people in the room. And I just don't have the ego. I've never wanted to be in the spotlight. I've never been the person who wants to be in front of somebody. And to a fault, probably have hurt myself in some respects entrepreneurially by not, doing that. But I think that's probably my greatest trait. I mean, the famous Coyote story. I know you had Cameron on here, but and I listened to his podcast. But the first day at Coyote, when Jeff said to me, "What do you want me to call you?" and I was like, "I don't want you to call me anything." He's like, "Well, what title should we give you?" I'm like, "I don't really, janitor. I don't know. I'm not really that concerned about the title coming in." At the time, Greg Siepel was the COO. And I was like, I'm not really worried about the title. And he's like, well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to figure out what needs to get done. And he's like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, I'm going to come in, I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to figure out what needs to get done. And he really brought me in originally to help with the U.S. Foods project because they were getting on a bunch of business and they didn't. He's like, I don't know anything about LTL, and I had built the LTL platform at Backhaulers and Robinson for Chicago Central, and I knew a lot about it. And I, was like, yeah, no problem. I can help you. We'll take it on. We'll service it. And so the first day I sat down, I sat next to Kate Van Dyke and Cameron, and I'm like, they're like, who is this old guy coming in here, sitting down next to me? And what is he here to do? And no, they didn't know me from
You're
anybody.
like, I'm the janitor.
And I was like, I think I said, I'm the janitor. Do you need me to help you make appointments? And I had done some training with rest in peace and a wonderful person, Piper, who trained me and was an incredible person. Sad loss for us as a family and of Coyote, and she trained me on the computer and the systems. And so I sat down and said, got any loads you need to enter or appointments you need made? And everything else just started coming to me from there. So that was my mentor style. It was like problems will come to me. People will say, well, how do I deal with this? And I remember the first meeting that we had with the management team, and Jeff was up at the board, and I think I made some comment like, what about this? Or why did we do this? And we left the meeting, and I think Danny Espelin or Pat came up to me and said, you're the first person that's ever spoken in a meeting other than Jeff or Marianne. And I was like, well, that's got to change. But they were all young and they didn't know anything. So it was fun. It was a really, really incredible opportunity to come in and see all these, people who really just needed to sort of have somebody to talk to about their issues, their problems with their freight, their life challenges. And I don't know, I just always felt like I was in touch with that.
One thing that you didn't say specifically, but kind of alluded to was asking questions. And I feel like that was something that you were very good at in generating conversations, starting conversations with people to think about problems and how to attack them. Is that deliberate, or that's just a natural curiosity when you think about your leadership style in challenging some of these young folks through getting them to think about problems in a different way? As I say that, does that jog anything for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that I generally like to ask questions because I want to see if people how they think about a circumstance or a situation. Unfortunately, one of my character flaws is that I'm not an empathetic listener. So I tend to start thinking about the answer faster than they're saying it. And then I want to talk, sometimes cut people off, and tend to want to get to the resolution relatively faster than some people are able to move. Um, but I do want to know if they're on the path. And I think one of the greatest skill sets that I've had throughout my career that I've often tried to teach people to do is what I used to say is sort of the 6 degrees of management, which would be 6 degrees out and 6 degrees down. I always tried to keep in touch with 6 degrees away from myself and the people surrounding me. So if you remember, like, at Coyote, I knew as many people that I managed directly as I did that they managed. And I always wanted to walk around the floor and talk to people. And, one of my claims to fame at Robinson was that I used to work later because I hated coming in the morning. I'm not a morning guy. And I used to work the West Coast very, very early on when we didn't have a West Coast. I was one of the first people to have West Coast freight. So I was always there from like 7 in the morning to 7 at night. And eventually I started coming in later because people wanted to come in early and leave early. And I came in later and stayed later. And I used to, every night before I would leave, I would go over to driver services and say goodbye to every single person that was there. And the last day at Robinson, I went to every single person's desk to say goodbye. I did the same thing at Coyote to each individual person to thank them, for the work that they did to help me be the success that I was, because it takes an effort by a team. But the ironic thing about that story was that at Robinson, the person who ran the driver services group that we had built, said to me, I just want you to know every single night you walked this way to say goodbye to us when there was a door 4 feet from your desk that you could have walked down to the garage. And I just want you to know how much it meant to every single person in this department. And I never thought about it. Like that just was the way I was raised, right? Like, these are people, and a part of it goes back to what we sort of talked about, which is like, I realized really early on the drivers are what put food on my table. The carriers and the drivers are really, and the customers too, but, you know, the drivers, if you treat them right, you treat them with respect, and you recognize how valuable and how completely irrelevant we are without them. You really recognize that everybody in this process in a non-asset based business is critical. So, getting back to your thought, your thought or your question, I think the questions that I asked were always to see how well people could come up with a solution on their own, were to try to understand what they needed to learn. And that 6 degrees was always to try to keep in touch with every person, connected to every other person. But you can't do that 10 wide or 20 wide. So I would be selectively trying to look at ways to position that. And then the other thing I used to say is probably what my greatest leadership style was, and the best ability to mentor people was, I was willing to give a lot of rope. I just had a really good sense of when we were going to need to, when something could choke us or when something could do damage to the business. And I think a lot of people have a very hard time delegating out that wide or far, to give people the rope necessary to really expand their own skill sets and develop their leadership skills. And I could just see it coming a mile away when there was going to be a problem that this was going to create, that was going to require somebody, something that was going to risk a customer or a carrier relationship or be big dollars, where I was going to need to be involved. And I think that those things really helped me to develop people and mentor people and really, create the business leadership that we had. And I used to always say I was a player's coach, right? I only wanted to be the person who made the decision when it was necessary. Otherwise, I was just a member of the team.
So there's a lot there. I think, for one, what I'm hearing, or what I'm sensing from that last bit is, makes me think about trust and the concept of trust. To build trust, you have to give trust, right? So you have to give that rope to people if you want to have a chance of them developing that skill, right? I mean, they're not going to develop it if you don't give them the opportunity to. But it is hard to know when you're putting yourself at risk by trusting someone that doesn't have the skill. So I guess it's kind of doing it with a watchful eye. And some of it is just, some people are just innately better at recognizing talent and recognizing that someone is capable of taking on more than they're currently taking on. So I think that's an interesting piece to what you said.
Yeah, I think
Another thought I have.
one real quick thing is, I do think some people are really good salespeople, like yourself, like Jeff, like some others. That I was never a great person at identifying the talent relative to sales. I was always like, God, I have faith in people. I always believe that people are good and that the good in people will come out. So I think I inherently trust and want to believe that everyone's capable. And until they disappoint you, or maybe that's the wrong word, until they prove themselves not worthy or capable, I always felt like everybody, given the right chance and the right help, could become a little better, if not a lot better, at what they do. So my job was to help them be a little better or a lot better at what they do. And, ironically, I don't know if you remember this story, but I think, at our first Christmas party at Coyote, you came up to me and you're like, I don't understand. Like, you had some question about driver services or dispatch, and you were like, I'm not really sure I shouldn't be doing your job. And I said, I'm not sure, Andrew, you won't be doing my job one day. And when you're ready to do my job, I hope you'll do it better than I will. And my job is to make sure that there's somebody there that'll do it better than I will, that will help the company succeed well past my timeline. And, that was just a real representation of your youth, your exuberance, your passion, your
Arrogance.
arrogance. It was all fun. And it was hysterical. I think I had your name tag. I think I still have your name tag from that party. But that was, I loved that part of my career, watching people who wanted to be even, greater than me. I was always like, go get it. There's a lot of talent out there. You should go get what you want.
You know, one other thing you said that really struck a chord with me and jogged my own memory is saying good night to every person as you're walking out the door, and even taking the long way, whether deliberately or you weren't taking the long way because you wanted to take the long way. This is part of what you felt you should be doing, is saying goodnight to everyone. When I think about my time at Molo, I think there are times where I was really dialed in and was being a great leader. I also think there are times where I was lost and was not on my game. But what you just said, and I'm very self-critical, and there's a lot of negative self-talk that it's hard for me to remember some of the good times now because I spent a lot of time thinking about the shit I did wrong. But what you said reminded me of, there was a period, I think for maybe 2 years as we were growing, where every morning the first thing I would do was just walk around and say good morning to everyone. And that was part of the best part of my day. And it became an expectation for people that they were going to see you. And if not, I'd get messages like, are you coming in today? Things like that. But your comment too about like the 6 degrees of separation out and down, I tried to stay as connected as possible with our team, especially those on the front lines, because that was how I thought I could really understand what we were doing well and what we weren't. I thought, essentially my job was to understand what our customers needed and communicate that back to the masses, and for us to make decisions based on that. And we looked at our customers as the shipper, the carrier, and the employee. I think the employee is such an important customer in a brokerage if you're doing it the right way. You spoke to non-competes and the idea that a non-compete is a fear-driven tactic versus, something I've always said, which is you shouldn't need them. You should just be focused on building the best business possible so people don't want to leave. But in any case, one of the challenges that we had, or I think some of my senior people felt they had, was people eventually thinking they could just go to me to get around their bosses, because they did feel like they had a direct line to me. And as we got bigger and bigger, when we were up over 500 people, it got to a point where it was almost like, Andrew, you shouldn't be trying to stay as connected with people on the front lines, because like there is a hierarchy that we need to follow, and directors and VPs can't feel like their orders are being ignored or something because a rep is going to just go direct to you to give their problem, and they know you're going to come back and try to get involved. So I don't know. That was a challenge that kind of came out of that. I'm just thinking of that now. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or
Yeah, that definitely does. I think
there's
it does happen. I think interestingly, I think anyone you would ever ask, and certainly even yourself throughout the conversations we had throughout our careers, I tell it like it is. I wear my heart on my sleeve. I had nothing to hide, and I don't sugarcoat too much. So for me, I would just turn around and I would not react in a way. I'd pull that person into the room and say, look, this person feels this way, and you manage this person, and we need to get to the bottom of this, right? Like what's the problem? And I think both people knew I had their back. So it wasn't ever, it comes back to your point about trust. Like, there was never a second guessing that person went around them, because I didn't let that stand. I didn't let that issue become fester, to a fault to us sometimes, because sometimes people would be less inclined to tell you the truth, right? Like one of the things about leading a big business and growing into the CEO that you became is that people tell you what you want to hear. I jokingly say throughout my career, I was never the person. There's an old UPS commercial, ironically UPS, where the guy, comes into the boardroom and the guy's like, tell me everything, I don't want you to be yes men. And it's called the yes man commercial. And I don't want you all to be yes men, whatever. And the guy says something and then he's packing his box. That's me, right? Like I'm the person who, when someone says, I don't want you to tell me what I want to hear, I'm like, okay, well, let me tell you what you don't want to hear. And then they're like, wait, I didn't really want to hear that. So, I was said that, but I didn't really mean it. It was funny. You talked about therapy. I'll tell you a funny therapy story. So after I left Robinson, I'm like, well, I'll go talk to a therapist. I got things to learn about myself and better myself. And I talked to a therapist for a year. And I had done therapy when I was a kid too. when I lost my dad, but it was different. And he said, Eddie, one of your biggest, greatest flaws, but incredible characteristics about you is when people, are like they go to the South and somebody says to them, "Oh, I wish I knew you were coming. I would have invited you for dinner." You actually think they mean it. Or when somebody says to you, "Oh, I haven't seen you in a long time. We should get together." You're the person who goes home and says, "Let's get together." Like it's just a saying, right? Like I'm literally like I can't lie. I don't have that like characteristic or ability to sort of sugarcoat. Like I just say it like it is. So it's ironic that I just never let that get in my way because I think that's one of my strengths, but it's a weakness. And I would be literally like talking a different language to people because I think they literally mean everything they say. And then when they don't, I'm like, okay, well then let's just deal with what you really mean.
It's interesting because in corporate speak, it doesn't work like that. I mean, once you get higher and higher in the corporate world, people never say what they mean, and it's always just kind of, what am I saying? There's just always, it feels like an ulterior motive or whatever. So I guess my question would be like, do you feel like there's a certain size company that you are best fit to be most effective at, or because I've wondered this about myself, and I don't know if it's just kind of that kind of negative self-talk or feel like I always told myself like I could never be a public CEO. Like I just would never, I just didn't have the chops for it, didn't have the MBA, all that stuff. But I'm curious if you have thinking about what you just said, if there's a thought there, like you fit really well in a certain
Yeah, I think if you're good, I think
spot or,
I mean I've always said this before. I don't know if you've ever heard me say it, but I don't do K through, I don't do elementary school K through 5, and I'm not real good at grad school. I love middle school, high school, and college. Those are the sweet spots of the age of a business for me. Too big is too siloed and too much politics, and too small is moving that flywheel. I didn't start there. So I always started with the foundation. And I feel like building off that foundation was one of my greatest strengths and taking it to a place where somebody else could come in and play the politics and do the corporate world is the sweet spot. And most of the people who worked directly for me at Coyote, I always taught them from day one that I was not going to be there past their time of, becoming the leaders they were capable of. I knew that I was leaving when Warburg sold or Warburg left. I just had no, you know, it's funny that you say that because I think if you look back on history and you think about history, most of the CEOs of very big public companies retained those roles because they had ownership and they had the ability to retain those roles and not be put out. I would guesstimate that if you look at why Zuckerberg is still running Facebook, even though he doesn't run necessarily, and they brought in people to accompany him, or Sergey and the Google story, or you know, there every one of those stories are people who retained ownership to the point where they had all the voting rights and they couldn't be kicked out. And then there's the Travis Kalanick stories and the other people who got put out because whether there were issues or the boards owned enough of the business. So one of the lessons in PE is if you raise money, know who owns your business and know the choices you make around control. Because I never thought I'd be the COO of a publicly traded company unless it just happened out of circumstance. But I certainly wasn't going to interview for that job and get it, playing politics or doing some PowerPoint presentation. I've said my whole career I'm a clay molder, not a model builder. My idea of a project plan is show me the clay, I'll mold you a beautiful, ship. But if you want someone to lay out the pieces on the table and put together a project plan and show you the box cover with the model on it, that isn't me.
So I'm curious because I sense that just from our time together at Coyote, and even just describing how you came into the business in your first day, sitting next to KVD and Cameron, two of the people who became some of the most talented leaders in the business, and just starting to ask questions and seeing how you could help. They were the clay, and you were seeing how you could mold it, right? And the business was also the clay, right? But I noticed you've joined boards and you've kind of gotten to that point in your career where you are more active on boards and not necessarily as kind of in the weeds, kind of 7 to 7. How do you mold clay from a board position, and how does kind of your mindset shift? Because it's harder to mold clay if you're not sitting there next to the two people asking the questions and seeing what you're doing. That's if that's your greatest skill, which I think I agree that's definitely one of them. How do you make that impact from a board level? And part of why I'm asking this is because I've thought about myself being able to join a board one day, but my skill is also in being in the business and seeing and understanding, okay, this is what the customer needs. This is what we have to give them. Can't necessarily do that from a board seat, or how do you do that from a board seat?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and it is probably one of the more challenging debates I have in my head because the one biggest thing we talked a little bit about this, but I'll just go back to it quickly. Um, I ended up doing board advisory work because I couldn't compete. So it goes back to the chief non-competing officer. But during that period of time, um, I got more comfortable with doing it, and I started to recognize that it was harder to go back to doing a 7 to 7 job and putting in 60 to 100 hours a week into a job, even though I missed mentoring and developing people. And there is sort of that missing piece of the puzzle that I crave. So I've tried to bridge that gap a little bit. It isn't the same. It doesn't give you the same satisfaction. It doesn't give you the same ability to effectively watch people grow up like your children do in a business. But I would say at the same time, if you do enough of them and you're involved in enough conversations, they sort of come to you with the same sort of questions like, hey, Eddie, have you seen this? What would you do about this problem? How would you address this? Or, what challenges have you seen? And then you're just working with a smaller group of executives and you can't see or effectively touch as much of the impact they're making. So you have to rely a little more on blind faith to sort of coach and develop them and let them sort of sink or swim. There's a lot more rope and a lot less of your ability to catch them if they fall. It's their business. They got to choose and decide how they're going to run it. They also don't necessarily always listen. But I do think generally it's similar discussions. And to your question earlier, or to your point earlier, it's asking questions, getting answers, and then seeing where you can add value and add and try to help. But it definitely doesn't have the same satisfaction level as it does when you're running a day-to-day business. And I do miss that a lot. I mean, it has been Sheer, we just hired a new CEO, and we discussed me taking that job, and I just wasn't ready to give up all the board seats I do and the advisory stuff I do and the lifestyle I live to go back into, a 60 to 100 hour a week business. And for what? I felt like I was getting a lot of really great experiences and a lot out of my career doing what I'm doing that, it's different, less satisfying in some respects and more satisfying in others.
So then let me ask you, how have your priorities changed, say today versus what they were 10 years ago?
Very good question. I don't think I've ever really thought about it. I think my priorities today probably are much more about giving back to people who I feel like I get a lot of phone calls from people who say, my kid wants to get into logistics. Can you talk to them about their career path or what? Or people who say, I'm thinking about a career change, or what do you think of this opportunity? Or Eddie, I don't understand this language in this document or convertible note, or how much should I invest in this, or why is this tax thing work this way? I just have a brain for that stuff. I don't know really why. I just do. I was always good at numbers. And so I feel like it's giving back, and it's different sort of dialogue, but it's the same. And I tend to not say no. When I turned 40, my dad passed away when he was 39 years old. And when I turned 40, I said, I'm not going to keep saying no. There's always a reason I can't go on that golf trip or that vacation, or my kids got this, or I got to work. I started to say yes a lot more to things, and I just sort of was willing to sort of explore and think about how I could make the, time we have on this earth as fun, enjoyable, valuable, and give back as much as I could to the people that I feel like, helped me get to where I am or wanted help. And I don't know, that's sort of my MO, and my priorities have changed a little bit about, I used to tell the training classes at Coyote and before Coyote, even at Robinson, that my goals were when I graduated college to make six figures by 26 and seven figures by 37. And I achieved both those goals. But I did that by starting out making 22.5 the first year, 25 the second year, 27.5 the third year, and 30 the fourth year. And I remember a conversation at Coyote where I said to, I don't know if you ever heard this story, but I used to tell the training classes, you know, how many of you got a college education and took on, 100,000, six figures worth of debt for a 4-year degree? And there'd be, X number of people that would raise their hand. And I'd say, how many of you, if I pay you 100 grand, will give me the next 4 years to teach you about freight before you ask me for a raise?
Hmm.
You're willing to take 4 years of college, take on 100 grand of debt, and learn limitedly almost nothing about business. I'm willing to pay you 100 grand for the next 4 years to teach you how to make a lot more money. You won't give me 6 months before you want to know how much more you're going to make.
I mean, the college education system is beyond broken.
Broken, yeah.
That's a whole.
Oh,
We're not
we
going to
can't go
spend
there.
30
Right.
minutes on that, but that is certainly one comment to be made with respect to that.
But my point being is that was really about, spending your time learning in the business, and not always about making money. So I feel like I'm giving back.
I mean, you mentioned twice now on here that your father passed away when you were 11. So, I mean, was that sudden? Was that kind of an illness expected thing, or how did you?
Yeah, so my dad was born with a heart valve issue that many people have. And as a result of that, at some point, including myself, who have the same condition, a lot of people never need surgery, and a lot of people do end up needing valve replacement surgery. His was damaged to the point where he needed to have it replaced, and for whatever circumstances happened, they monitored it for a long time and then decided it was the right time to do it. Surgery went okay, but something happened, and no one really knows what transpired. But he died 9 months later, and I only talk about it because it was probably the greatest impactful thing in my life that changed the trajectory of who I am and why I am. As my mother likes to say, I got the mold, but I didn't get the bronze, because when you don't grow up with a father, I was never really taught how to schmooze or, play the game. Maybe that's why I don't do so good in grad school and politics. But it changed the whole person that I am. I mean, I always tell people I wouldn't trade who I am today because of those circumstances. I grew up very early. I was the only male in my family, other than my cousin. But my direct family was my sister, my mom, my aunt, and my mom's sister and her two daughters, and I was the only male, other than the other side of my family with one male cousin. But you know, I just learned a lot of hard knocks very early on in life, and it changed the trajectory of who I probably would have become, who I am, and how I parent. And it's funny you talk about the lessons you've learned as in business. I always say it's amazing to be a father when you didn't have a father to learn from. At 11, I knew who my dad was, but I didn't know a lot about how he parented. As an adult male, right? And your kids aren't born with an instruction manual, although it'd be really great if it came with like 6,000 pieces of Legos and an instruction manual that tells you how to raise your kid. I'm not sure it would be right, but it would certainly. And I'm not sure you wouldn't want to return it to IKEA. But it's interesting. That's how I've always looked at life in general. It's a journey and a challenge, and you try to find your way. So it was a very impactful thing in my life, and it definitely is 90% of who I am, that impacted moment.
How do you think that changed how you've viewed your own parenting and just your life now living past that number? You know, has it given you a more kind of serious understanding of how fragile life is? I mean, just give me some understanding of how that's kind of changed how you think about your own life and the parenting you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's affected every choice and every decision that I made, and certainly when you ask me, about like the mentoring and not being as close to the process when you're on the board level versus in the running in the business. Um, I think about like, we're I tell my kids we're all going to the same place, and there's a whole lot more people there than there are here. So when we're going, you know, I don't know, but I'm going to try to do the most I can with this time in this life to enjoy the opportunities and the things that I have been afforded. And a lot of that, for people, you know, differs in what they choose to do with that time on Earth. For me, it's probably about interacting with people and trying to give back and certainly be a good role model and a mentor. I tell my kids, look, Warren Buffett's going to die maybe broke if he gives it all away under that thing he signed up for, but there will not be a dollar amount on his gravestone. Every gravestone you see talks about that he was a loving, respected father, brother, parent, son, friend. There's no dollar amounts on
It's
the
who you are to
gravestone. It's
others.
who you are to others and who shows up at your funeral. Hopefully, not a lot of people because you outlive them all. But relatively speaking, I try to do what matters when people, you know, I make that phone call that you need to make. I try to teach my kids to be polite people who give back and are respectful to others and recognize that the world's a tough place and not everyone's nice, but uh, look at the bright side and hold your head high and try to, be the quality person that you want others to be. Hopefully, what comes around
That's
goes
all you
around.
can do. Yeah, I believe that. I think I don't know. I struggle with thinking about work, and now as I get close to building a family, I'm getting married soon and wanting to have kids pretty soon thereafter. It's like, you mentioned before we started the call that, like, you don't necessarily want to go back to the 60, 70 hours a week because it's just that stress, and is it worth it? I definitely, there's a part of me that is now not desperate. I really miss building. Um, and it's not that I miss 12-hour days or miss sending emails to customers at 9 o'clock at night, but I just miss the camaraderie and the team and the results that you see in building. I miss that so much. And I want it back. And I'm not saying I need it back in brokerage, but I just want it in some fashion. But separately, I've had a conversation with my fiance where she's like, listen, you're not, if you go back and start something, you're not traveling 4 days a week again like you used to, flying around the country to see customers all the time. Like, we're building a family, we're going to do it together. So, like, managing those priorities, my family will always be the priority, but there's also that need to make an impact and impact others. Um, I think about legacy a lot, and what I wanted to, I always appreciated kind of seeing how many people at Coyote were impacted by what we all built together, and looking up to my parents and seeing kind of the impact that they had on so many people. And it's like, I wanted that for myself. I wanted to be able to look back in 20 years and see that there were people who were grateful to what I helped them create in their own life. And, I don't, there are parts of me that feel like we did a lot of that, but there are also parts of me that feel like there's something left still out there that I need to do. So I don't know. I just am thinking about this as we talk about
I
that.
think you're right, though. I think that, one is about self fulfillment and self, desire to do what you're capable of, both, you know, from a skill set standpoint. You want to grow as an individual, both as a parent and as a professional. It's very difficult to grow as a professional not working full time. Part time doesn't really do it. So it's a balancing act, right? And I think for people who didn't experience what I experienced, um, you know, fatherhood, like I remember when my son was born, it was like a completely, like, he was the firstborn, like I was like, this is what all I ever wanted to do was be the dad my dad didn't have the chance to be. That was so much more of an impactful part of my life than most people who grew up with a father. Um, you know, but there's plenty of people who've grown up in divorced households or, challenging circumstances that they have different circumstances that drive their desire to be a parent. And it's a balancing act. Some people really need the professional, uh, you know, impact to self be the person they want to be. It doesn't define them, I wouldn't say, but it helps them be a better person, a better, that's their hobby, that's their sport. I would say Jeff and Paul, that's their sport, right? Winning in business, like Jeff used to always be like, I can't believe you're wasting 4 hours golfing, right?
He still says
Right,
that.
exactly. So, and Paul used to be like, what do you mean you're going to the Cubs game? And I'd be like, what do you mean I'm going to the Cubs game? He's like, well, there's freight on the board. And I feel like, there's always freight on the board, Paul. Thank God there's always freight on the board. Thank God there's always freight on the board. But he would have that way of being like, then he'd call you at the Cubs game. That load isn't moving. You'd be like, yep, I know. I see.
If you were here, it'd have been
Right. It
moved.
would have been moved, so, and you laugh because that was their sport. That was I just, a part of me, I feel like just sort of looks at the world and says, look, there's other parts to it also. I've traveled a ton. I've seen so much. I love history. I just think that the world, we're here for such a short period of time in the scheme of how long the life has been around that, there's a lot to do and a lot to see and a lot of things that drive or impact the person that you are. But it's hard. You can do a lot of that part time, but you can't do what you're talking about part time. And you just got to balance it. But you will, because you won't, you'll live the normalized life of what people who had the ability to look back and say, I know what that balance can be. Yes, there's going to be times where it's not as balanced as I'd like it to be. There are other times I need to prioritize my family in front of the work because it's just that balance needs to, tip the scales that way. Because you grew up in a more balanced environment to begin with, even though I know your family, your parents were divorced when you were younger. But I think generally speaking, some people have the ability to balance those things out. For me, the weight was so heavy on the be the father side that I was willing to sort of think about. And then the non-competes got in the way, and I started doing things that didn't allow me to go back to work full time. And my kids were young enough, and I got to spend all those years with them, even though they didn't really want to spend any time with me when they were that age and older. They were about their friends. So you'll figure it out. I think you'll do a fine job at satisfying both sides of that equation because I think the world needs your talent, your skill, your passion, your drive. You'll find your way.
Thank you. I guess a lesson here for those listening is do the work to know what you want. And it's not easy, but figure it out because then that'll drive you, I think, in the direction you need to go. And don't let the forks, whether they're intentional or they're thrown in front of you like a non-compete, don't let those take up too much of your time and energy, and find a way to make the most of it. Because it sounds like for you ended up with a pretty nice situation where you got this part-time stuff as a result of the non-compete, and that allowed you to focus on the fatherhood aspect that was important to you. So I don't know. I'm looking for lessons here.
As the Coyote
It's kind of
kids used to say, right? A lesson learned. That was
a lesson
that's
learned.
they created that phrase. It might have been Campbell. I can't remember who it was. Might have been Cameron. Um, yeah, I think. Look, I think what's most fascinating about our industry is that, um, again, I don't know if you ever heard me say this, but if you work in customer service at ComEd, or Xfinity Cable, the people that call you are like, they don't call to say, hey, thanks, my remote works so well. I love that talking command into the remote control. And hey, ComEd, thank you. My power works 99.99% of the time. Those people field calls every day from people who are
That's a
like,
good one.
my power's out. Why does my cable not work? And in freight,
It's usually not said so nicely.
right. And in freight, we're fortunate because it's a transactional business. The cost of doing business for most of the customers we do work for, that they give you the opportunity and the trust to service their needs. They're not calling to say thank you. They don't call you to congratulate you on a load well moved. They call you with a problem, like the customer service people get calls at Comcast, and that's the luxury and the incredible fortune we have in being in a business that's daily and transactional, and not a diagnosis by a doctor that tells you what's wrong, fixes you, and you don't want to ever come back. So, we're fortunate to work in a space that's incredibly challenging, incredibly, just gift giving, and I've been so blessed. And now I've seen a lot of different sides of it. I work with a Brazilian company. I worked on some of the early stage sides of it. I work with a warehouse and trucking company, a managed trans business. I've looked. Now I'm working with a company called Better Trucks that's doing small parcel, final mile stuff. I love looking at every facet of logistics in the industry, and I think we're fortunate to have the opportunities to do that. And I think you will find your way, no problem, to put your stamp on something that'll make the world a better place in logistics terms, or in some other way if you choose to go that direction.
Well, with that, I think I want to dive into one of these businesses that you've been, you mentioned several there. We've been going for an hour and a half. So, it would be a disservice not to jump into at least one. So let's talk about the managed transportation business. Let's talk about Sheer. Um, why managed trans? Why specifically Sheer? Like what brought that into the fold for you?
So managed trans is an interesting part of the industry, which obviously you're familiar with, but for people who aren't as familiar with it, back in the backhaulers days, prior to Robinson buying us, which inevitably the technology became what is the platform that is the TMC of Robinson today, that Jordan Cass leads. Jordan Cass was actually given to me by your father to manage when he came out of training. Jeff liked to give me the more challenging projects, and Jordan was a really smart, passionate, driven kid who just wanted to conquer the world, and I think he had no patience for anything. So we developed what became sort of the managed trans sort of business out of backhaulers, and one of the first customers came out of our group after the initial ones that are well known from Jordan and I think Scott Simonic. But we had Ocean Spray, and they came to us and wanted to do a managed trans business, and we weren't really ready, and so we put them off on them, and they came back around after they had done a contract with Schneider Logistics. We did their business, and um, I've always felt that part of the business was a really more interesting part of the business for me. It was less commoditized. It was much more strategic in discussions around the supply chain and how to help a business, you know, execute. But in 2011 or 2010, when I got to Coyote, and I think Heineken was really still pretty early on in the CTM experience, I remember having a conversation with Jeff and Pickett and Bill and Sisler, even too. Maybe I don't remember who else. Maybe it was Danny because he was working on Coke at the time or running the enterprise team. But I felt like the managed trans side of the business was just in the early stages of, or the early innings of the game. Because if you look at businesses that outsource, right?
You're talking about from the industry in general?
Correct. Correct.
Okay, just to
No,
clarify.
that
Yep.
good clarification. The industry, you know, I felt like that I don't want to go on too long about this, but people had Y2K in 2000 had caused a lot of people to invest in ERP and technology because the Y2K scare, and it kicked the can down the road a lot longer on the technology cycle for people to invest in technology because they had just all done it in 2000 to get ready for Y2K. And then you had the '08 sort of Great Recession. So coming out of that period of time, technology was innovating and technology was aging. And so what transpired during that period of time was I had looked at the industry and said, you know, look, ADP is an outsource for payroll. There's a lot of outsourced manufacturing. There's outsourced HR. There's outsourced other areas. And most of it, you know, had a lot to do with whether it was manufacturing or services, had a lot to do with the fact that it wasn't a core competency of companies. And other than prior to 2000, when Walmart made supply chain a core competency and a differentiator in how they sourced and bought product to bring pricing down and to grow their business that many followed, including Home Depot and others, there really wasn't a reason why companies were in the execution part of transportation. It made no sense to me ever that there's a person, not that the job didn't make sense, but that there's a person worrying about a single transaction occurring through a TMS on the customer buying side of transactions of freight, strategically owning the decisions about who does that freight and managing what awards happen and how you manage the relationships and make the determinations about who should do what with a party that executes made a ton of sense to me. And whether you think about that from the financial institution space as an example of when you had a broker versus a wealth manager, as an example, I just always felt like the industry would evolve to be less owned TMS and more owned strategy and outsourced execution. And so that kind of played out when that first evolution of technology occurred after the Y2K and the Great Recession. And it was the catalyst to a lot of large companies making those choices. But the smaller businesses really just outsourced, right? They were single sourcing or there was somebody's job at stake. And so coming, you know, full circle to the current age, a lot of the companies that evolved those technologies, whether it was CTM, TMC, Transportation Insights, XPO, Menlo that got bought, all these businesses became Transplace. They are behemoth now. So for them to penetrate and work with the small business or the mid-sized customer is a very challenging thing. They're much less flexible. They need to get bigger customers to make a bigger impact on their bottom lines and on their revenues. So coming out of COVID, I thought that the market looked ripe for small business and mid-sized customers to be like, we do not want to be back in this challenge with supply chain. Again, we don't want to be in the execution business. We need technology to help us better supply chain decide. And there was a void in the small business and the mid-size area of managed trans. So had been looking for a managed trans business for a while. I've probably looked at many. And Sheer was the second one. We had a LOI in place and an exclusivity on a different business that came to market 6 months earlier that ended up not selling. At the final hour, the capital partner decided to keep the business, probably because I shared too much off my cuff again, like I'm doing now, about why I like the space. But ultimately, we knew this business was coming to market, and we thought we would buy it as an add-on and bid for it. But we didn't get the other deal because they walked away, so we went aggressively after this one because it was enticing. I think the space has a tremendous amount of upside. I think of it like NetSuite was to SAP in terms of the void. And I think we can build a better mousetrap than anyone else because the people who have built the best mousetraps are busy taking care of their big customers and their large, you know, managed trans product categories. And there's a lot of competition, don't get me wrong. But there's just a void, I think, that needs to be filled. And I think we're going to, try to fill it. So we have a great team and a great product, and we loved Sheer because the founder, Joe, had built a business. He came from Hub, and worked on the managed trans and intermodal side at Hub. And he built this business really the way you and I sort of looked at how businesses were born and grown, really, based on the service lines and the relationship with the customers and building a great product first. So they had a great product, a very mature product for the marketplace with a little less of a sales force and a little less of a kind of a path to scaling and strategic way to invest in the business without a capital partner. So it was a perfect making of put these three people together, the Woodlawn part, the operating side, Monroe Capital with the capital side, and the Sheer team, and try to really help the industry evolve and grow into a, penetrate the mid-market and the small customers on the managed trans side.
Is the thought so first of all, I mean, it makes everything, the thought path makes a ton of sense to me, especially looking at COVID as kind of like the black swan event that has these teams realize, like, listen, we were not built to be a transportation company. We make
widgets.
Mugs. And like, we're really good at making mugs. People love these mugs. I have no idea why it costs $1,200 to go from Chicago to Cincinnati to move these mugs, and why 2 months later it's $1,800. And I get that, and I think I'm picking up what you're putting down there. I'm curious if your thought on the growth then is to create the playbook, the sales playbook and the execution playbook, and then go M&A and go find 10 other Sheer-like companies and aggregate them, kind of Brad Jacobs style, or more build the right team. You've got your CEO now, and let them organically build the culture, or continue to build on the culture that Sheer has to kind of build this thing the way you've historically been a part of growing companies.
I think it's both. I think that the challenge with doing acquisitions of managed trans businesses or boutique or unique, I usually call them boutique, logistics businesses, is they don't sell in the bottom of the market. You're always going to pay towards the top, as we knew we were buying at the peak. It's hard to buy them when you're not buying the tech and the underlying skill set just for the customers and the person and the employees and the culture. So rolling them up is a little tougher on the managed trans side, I think. Although there are some segments of the industry and verticals that are specialized in that category. Automotive is one of them. Chemicals is one of them. There are others. So I do think there is a possibility we'll look at strategic acquisitions there. I think we will also look at strategic acquisitions for companies that have a Rolodex of transactional customers that are single source, or that are potential, brokerages that focus more on the smaller mid-sized customer and that we could try to penetrate. One of the challenges with this business is timing, right? So you have to sell transactional services to customers until they're ready, whether they're in the cycle of working with another third party that's managing their trans, or they're in an outsourced relationship, a single source by plant, or it's decentralized, or, all the things about why the economic decisions are made the way they are. It will just be a matter of timing. So we want to have a relationship building opportunity with that customer, doing transactional services with them prior to selling that. And we also want to sell value logistics if it's not capable to sell them technology. There are going to be large customers that are never going to outsource or use managed trans. Maybe they'll use managed trans solutions for project management or specific parts of their business, some companies that do that today. But they're not going to. They're still going to own an ERP and a TMS, and they're going to, manage and own the technology. And so maybe we have to just sell value and project freight services around that. I just don't want to. I never loved. It's funny when we talk about backhaulers. When I got to backhaulers, I don't know if you ever heard the story, but Jeff was selling paper. Paul was I don't know, raw materials and chemicals or something. I don't know what he's minerals, sand and minerals, and Noam was metals, and Harold became metals, and Gary was plastics, and they were broken up into verticals because those companies, those business lines were all companies that had huge expenses related to transportation. As a result of that, they were the first people willing to talk to brokers because transportation made such a big impact on their profitability. So they were willing to save money at any cost. So $50 mattered. So when I told you the story about beating Paul, Paul had customers that he'd make $50 on. I was like, I am not doing this work for $50. But it was the 90s, not the 80s, right? So I was in a business ability to go out and sell to like CPG and customers that needed print customers that needed expedited services. So I was making, $150 or $250 a rip. And I was selling like LTL that we could piece together and make multi drops and pool distribution, all this other stuff I had learned.
Mhm.
So generally speaking, just the industry as a whole has evolved. And I think, I lost my train of thought on the managed trans side of it, but you know, those people that like commodity freight, they sell volume, right? And it's getting more and more difficult to make spreads because the spreads are more visible through technology, right? The spreads are tighter, just like any market. Their, seasonalities are more known. You know when the market's shifting. So you got to do a lot of volume and digital services and digital connections. And, it's going to be a fight to the volume and the cost structure of how you execute the best on the commodity side. I don't want to try to play in that park, and I
Yeah.
don't think I can win that game.
Well, I think what you were alluding to was you don't love the brokerage space so much today as maybe it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. But, Shear has to play in that space to get to where it wants to go with customers, right?
I do love that space. I just don't think it's easy to win against
Yeah.
very well
That's what I
capitalized
meant. Love it
behemoth
from, yeah.
companies that are building the ability to move massive volume. I just don't think I can win that game. So I'd rather try to focus on the areas that are harder for them to win, which is the small business and the medium-sized customers that I think are really labor intensive to capture. They're very hard to, they don't move the needle for a large company as easily. And I think that's not going to be the end game for the large institutional players in the space. They need to win at the lowest cost denominator to deliver the capacity to a customer with the best spread they can get, but they need to do it with volume. I want to do it through managed trans and through sort of value logistics solutions.
Yeah. It's interesting because I always thought that the next frontier for what I wanted to be able to do with my business was get to managed trans. And what I saw was we had built out such an exceptional operations product, and the people on that team were just so dialed in and just fundamentally understood how to take care of a customer better than most. And I didn't feel that the competition within managed trans businesses, the operations folks, were at anywhere near the level that my people were at. And we didn't have the, proprietary technology built out to do that. But I do remember, there were a few customers, and one of them was really large, that they were working with a specific managed trans company that got bought recently. And I knew that within 12 to 18 months, their business was going to be for sale. And all I was thinking was, man, we're the top provider in their network. Why can't it be us? So like I'm picking up what you're putting down. And I do think that if you have the right people operating in that business, there is a leg up there. Because I don't feel like a lot of the managed trans operations folks, one thing that brokers are exceptional at over time is solving problems and doing it with a voracious speed. Because we do it like our life's on the line and like our business is on the line. And I don't feel like that's necessarily the case with a lot of managed trans companies, that because most of the time those operations folks don't have that brokerage experience and they don't move at that same pace. But if they did and they had that fundamental, like true understanding of freight and lanes and rates and what it's like dealing with these carriers and how to solve these problems quickly, I feel like the results would be better and the customer would be happier. So I do see an opportunity there. It's something that I've thought about a lot, but never, got to bring to fruition.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the fact is there are managed trans technology companies, and then there's managed trans execution companies. And I think what we want to do is be a combination of both. And I think the execution side comes from that brokerage background, really understanding how to truly execute in a manner that is to the level, but there's a cost to it. And it's hard to get that cost out of a technology sale or transactional execution where you're just sort of, you know, putting in route guide information and running it through a waterfall, and it goes to the carrier and they accept or reject, and then track and trace is done through whatever technology source the customer chooses. Like that's a different business model. So it depends who the customer is and the client is and how service oriented their needs are, whether they're the plastics customer or the CPG or the right. So you got to build what the customer needs. And I think that to your point, there's tons of opportunity there. And it's funny that you said, Sheer, the reason for the name of the business is transparency, right? Because Sheer is transparent, so you can see through. And that's the idea, is to try to give transparency, to our customers to really understand, and we did that really well at Coyote too. But I think, the idea around everybody is, how do we give our customers the opportunity to help them better succeed and better understand how we make money? No one seems to mind that StubHub and Uber make 10%. But they seem to really balk at when a broker makes 12 on a freight move. And ironically, those people have no capacity sourcing needs, right? So it's amazing to me that the labor cost for those two businesses at 10% is so much less. And people are like, no problem. But in freight brokerage, we want to make 15%, not even 20, because we have two sides of the sourcing responsibility and operational needs that are far exceeding what somebody does on a commoditized transaction. And people balk about the percentages. And it's typically on a lower dollar amount, which is even more surprising. But maybe not a lower dollar amount on the top line side of a ticket or an Uber. But, I think just generally speaking, this gives you an opportunity to have a conversation with a customer about what you make, why you make it, how you make it, where your costs are. Those are the things that I just found more interesting about the business than just some of the commoditized stuff that you have to do to grow volumes. Love all the parts of the business, but this is one that I've been fascinated by for a long time and really felt like was where I wanted to spend my time with the rest of my career, hoping that this will be maybe not the final chapter, but one of the later chapters.
One of the later chapters. What would you say, you're a year into it now? What's been the biggest surprise now that you're kind of fully engaged in the managed trans world?
Well, I just wrote our investor group a year-end message, and I said the unfortunate thing is that I'm not surprised about anything, which is incredible. The thing that is surprising to me is that I knew there was going to be a downturn, and I know I'm a pretty good sort of economist, if you call that. And I understand macro and microeconomics pretty well. And what I didn't think hard enough about was how high the peak was to think about how deep the trough would be. And that is really what's driving the problem today around inventory bloating and oversupply. And so the market is really, really as challenging as it's ever been. But I do think that there's a bottom that, there's a point where carriers just won't move freight. And then there's a little bit more pressure on the third parties in the middle as customers continue to take advantage of those lower rates and push the market before it rebounds. But I didn't see the trough as deep as it has become, although I was expecting a downturn. And I didn't realize that a managed trans business doesn't necessarily really know well enough how to execute, to your point, as transactionally as we grew up doing, even though they do transactional work. So we've had to sort of build that out a little further than I would have expected. But otherwise, I'm not surprised about anything. They have a great piece of proprietary middleware. They have, a great team. They have built their business on satisfying and servicing customers as well as anybody I've ever done work with in terms of, we did a voice of customer before we did the acquisition, and every customer raved about them, and it stayed true to date. And they have real, true, sheer conversations like, this doesn't work for us. Does this work for you? And that's the part that excites me about the industry and the way, whether you were interviewing, Kevin or Bill or Cam, I mean, everyone's talking about like the more strategic conversations, not just a bid package anymore. Like people really want to understand, um, how they can interact with the people they do business with. Everyone always talks about how they understand it needs to be profitable for everybody, but with a little more transparency and a little less fighting for the the dollars, I think that really comes to fruition where people really start to think about how do we work together to solve these problems, because markets will go up and markets will go down.
I think it's a product of kind of the information age and the fact that it's just all so available to us. I mean, companies like FreightWaves exist, and there's just so much more focus and ability to share data and see it. I mean, you talk about how the industry's got more commoditized and how, there's you didn't say this and you didn't even mean it, but like a broker could more easily take advantage of a shipper 5 years ago versus now. Because now a shipper can see how the market is really behaving in as close to real time as possible. And it just is allowing for more educated, more informed decisions to be made. And frankly, I think the convoy thing too plays into this, in shippers wanting to be more strategic and more knowledgeable about what's really going on behind the curtain for their partners. It's interesting because I love, transparency. I'm all about it and think that that's I learned about it through just how we led our people, but I was not afraid. I wanted to venture into a world where our customers could see our margins one day. And like, that won't happen with me at the helm there, but
well, I think that discussions happen, but it doesn't really solve the problem. I think what you're talking about, and I've said this before, I've been known for my analogies throughout my career, but I'll leave you this one. E-Trade, which I don't know how much you remember, but was the first digital trading platform that came to market in the financial services industry. It came to market with 1999 trades. And the reason it was able to do that was because there are exchanges that exist and transactions where the buy and the sell, or the bid and the ask, are based on contracts that are all very simplified contracts. Our business is much harder because the contracts involve a lot more variables than a single transaction like a 55-gallon drum of oil, or a contract like a stock contract. But the interesting thing about the dynamics of that are, if you look at where floor traders made all their money back before digital marketplaces or E-Trade or what we currently trade on like Robinhood, is they made all their money because there were wide spreads between the bid and the ask, and they were the only people that knew what was going on in the market on the floor. There was no screens. There was nobody. The buyer and the seller had no idea what was going on in the market. So if you look at the evolution of how markets become more efficient in general, freight is no different. The difference is there's no exchanges, and there's no simple contract. So it can't get to that point where you'll get complete digitization and no spread between bid and ask, because there's always going to be variables that drive things, and there's service lines and people and drivers who will make decisions around why freight doesn't make sense to them. And I love the driver who wants to drive empty from Dallas to Chicago because he doesn't want to take it for 85 cents a mile, even though you're not the person telling him he should. That's just what the market bears, and he's upset, so he drives empty. That doesn't come into play in digital marketplaces, right? That's irrational or logical. I don't know which one, but regardless, the markets will not get to that. Right, will not get to that efficiency because the contracts are too tough and the bid spreads. But the bid spreads have come, to your point, they have gotten so much tighter, and there's no more I know before you know. Everybody knows when the market's soft or tight. Everybody knows what's going on in the marketplace in real time. And so that changes the game a lot, and it creates the environment where efficiency drives transparency, and it also drives people to need to do more volume, lower margins, and truthfully just be better at execution.
Last question. When does the market turn? That's the one that people really want. You self-proclaim you're an economist here. So
let me digest it this way. With interest rates as high as they are and with the rates as low as they are, there should be a supply side correction that should drive capacity out of the marketplace, whether the drivers park their trucks and go drive for Uber, or they go and do something in construction or oil or whatever. There should be a supply side correction that drives.
but
Go ahead.
but is that contingent on kind of the war chest built up through COVID being dwindled enough?
So
Because I think that was a contributing factor to these guys hanging on so long.
there is no doubt that forget why we have the supply of volume that we have or the capacity amount that we have in the space. What's challenging to me about that question has always been unemployment at the lowest rate that it's been in history and certainly been low for a while. There are jobs available. So why, if they're not making money today, aren't they just leaving the industry? And I think a lot of it has to do with they probably have lease payments. They bought a truck, they own a truck, or companies bought trucks, they have drivers in them, they're paying the drivers, they're trying to get through the cycle. But I think that cycle has come to a place where people just can't make money and they're going to get out of the space. So I do think we will see supply side diminish a little bit, less capacity availability. And I do think we will work through some of the bulk inventory problems that have existed that are different than the other sort of inventory problems that we worked through over the last 12 to 18 months. Bulk inventory is a major problem because if you bought a tanker or you had to buy a boat to bring product in liquid or bulk, you probably had a year or 18 months of excess inventory, not 3 months or 6 months. So that, which ultimately drives some also additional capacity in some other areas when it gets domestic or, in the US and has to be transported, it doesn't get transported in bulk the same way. It could by rail car, but we won't get into that. So I think there's going to be a supply side correction that plays out in the first half of this year. I do think the bulk side will decrease in inventory buildups and start to get replenishment orders. And I think oversupply of bloating will, of other inventories will rationalize. So I think we'll have a stabilization. My problem is the demand side. And my problem with the demand side is that during COVID, every single person had no access to purchase any services or travel or goods, or non-goods, right? They were purchasing all material goods. And everyone I know, except for buying stuff that they would go out in or use to go out because they weren't leaving or doing anything, bought like tons of stuff for their house, or even like rented houses and bought stuff for that house, or now look, I'm not talking about the average person, but generally speaking, people did buy material goods at a rate that reminds me of like a Christmas splurge for buying like Tickle Me Elmo, where everybody's got to have it. So everybody buys a new TV. If we just squished 5 years of purchasing of goods into a 18-month period of time, it is going to take 5 years or so for that to wear out. It goes back to my Y2K example on technology. When everybody buys new technology in Y2K in 2000, they don't go, there's a void in technology sales for 3 to 4 years. And I think that's what COVID did to demand on the good side. And I think that challenge is going to be a real one that's going to take a little longer than people think to work through. So I'm calling for a fourth quarter start in post-election, assuming it's not whatever political side you're on, a disaster. I don't know what that means or what that means to each of you that are listening, but whatever that is, let's assume it's a somewhat fair and legitimate election and we don't have a civil war or something else, I think we will see a fourth quarter surge. Once that's past us, it'll be a good holiday season and a stronger 2025. But I don't see anything before that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I appreciate the depth to that answer. It feels like every time I listen to a public company talk about this, they just say 6 months.
They have to.
And they've been saying 6 months for the last 2 years. It's just, there's nothing to back it up that makes sense.
Well, look, there's not a lot of people on CNBC that talk about the market crashing. There's not a lot of people in public companies in general that talk about things that are negative. You get no benefit for being a negative. Yeah. This goes back to why I quit grad school, right? Like, I'm not a politician. I have to tell the truth, and I would be the person to be like, I don't think the market's going to rebound. The stock would go down $10. I'd get fired. That's the truth. They can't tell. They got to tell. They can say 6 months, but if they say a year, people are going to be like, well, then what are you going to do about it? You got to grow your business. You got to, satisfy your investors, right? Exactly. Yeah. They're doing it anyway.
It's true. Okay. We've hit the 2-hour mark. We're past it, actually. So this has been great. I appreciate your transparency, your sheerness.
Thank you.
Is that the right way to say that?
Sheerness.
Sheerness. So this has been fun, and we'll have to have you on again sometime. We'll do some more of this. So
good luck with the upcoming
parting words?
Nuptials. Make sure you write your vows and read them clearly, and never forget the more important part of the situation, which is her, not you. And Great to catch up. Happy New Year. Congrats on your Michigan win, and best of luck in your next chapter. I'm certain I will not only read about it, but hear about it, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks to our listeners. We'll see you again next week.